Michael had just completed one of the biggest deals of his life. It was the kind of deal that could change everything for his business. He felt a surge of pride as he walked down the jet bridge to board the flight. The destination was clear. The plane was waiting for him to finally sit back and relax after days of stressful negotiations. But as he stepped onto the aircraft, the sense of relief he had been hoping for was quickly replaced by something much more unsettling. His first-class seat was exactly where it should be, the kind of luxury that made the entire trip worth it. He settled into his seat, carefully holding his daughter in his arms. She was small and delicate, her soft baby blanket draped across her tiny body. As she slept peacefully, the hum of the plane's engines was a comforting sound that usually helped Michael forget about the world outside. But today it didn't help. Today something felt off. The flight attendants were busy buzzing up and down the aisles preparing for takeoff, but there was an unusual distance between them, and Michael, he couldn't help but notice that they seemed to be avoiding eye contact with him. No smiles, no friendly greetings like he was used to on flights like this. They'd moved past him quickly without acknowledging his presence. He glanced around trying to make sense of it, but everyone else was getting the full service. People were being offered drinks, snacks, and even a friendly word or two. Michael adjusted his daughter in his lap, hoping that maybe this was just a minor oversight, a mistake that would be corrected soon. After all, it was a busy flight, and there were other passengers to attend to. But as the minutes passed and the plane taxied down the runway, he began to feel an uncomfortable weight in his chest. This wasn't right. He watched as one of the attendants, a woman named Sarah, passed by him again. She was serving the passenger next to him with a smile and a polite conversation. She handed over a drink with a light laugh before turning away. But as she passed Michael's seat, she glanced over quickly and then looked away. It was subtle, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through him. His daughter stirred in his arms, and he gently rocked her back to sleep. He reached up to press the call button, but before his finger could even reach it, Sarah was already gone. She had passed by once more. Without offering him a glance, he looked at the button in front of him, then back at Sarah's retreating figure. His frustration began to grow. Was it possible he had misread the situation? Was it something about him? Maybe the baby was causing a distraction, but that didn't seem right. He tried to dismiss the feeling, but the quiet tension in the air was hard to ignore. It felt like everyone else on this plane was being treated like they were important, while he and his daughter were invisible. He watched as the flight attendants continued to move around the cabin, taking orders from everyone else with ease. No one stopped at his row. No one even looked his way. He glanced down at his daughter, still cradled in his arms, and for a moment he questioned if maybe this was just a momentary lapse. Maybe things would get better once the plane reached cruising altitude. But as time passed and the attention from the flight attendants never came, Michael couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was something deeper, something uncomfortable, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The air felt heavier now. He looked around the cabin, trying to make sense of it all. But the more he looked, the more he realized this wasn't a coincidence. Not the way they were treating him or his daughter. This was deliberate. And as the realization hit him, Michael's heart began to race. The calm he had once felt was now replaced by a quiet anger he couldn't explain. The wheels of the plane continued to spin on the runway, and the sound of the engines still hummed in the background. But everything else had faded. The only thing that mattered now was the feeling of being unseen, of being treated like he didn't belong in this space. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Michael tried to settle his nerves. He shifted in his seat, cradling his daughter more carefully in his arms, her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. As she slept soundly, his mind kept racing back to the moment when Sarah had glanced at him, then quickly looked away, as if he wasn't even there. The sting of that moment lingered in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He turned his attention back to the cabin around him. The flight attendants were still moving up and down the aisle, but now it was almost as if they were moving faster, avoiding the gaze of anyone sitting in the first-class section. At least that's how it felt. Michael had never been one to overreact, but this was different. This was more than just poor service. This was something he couldn't ignore. Sarah passed by once more. This time she was carrying a tray of drinks for a couple seated further down the aisle, As she approached their row, she smiled and greeted them warmly. They laughed, exchanged pleasantries, and she offered them their drinks with an ease that seemed so natural. Yet, when she reached his row, she didn't even break her stride. She didn't pause or look at him. She simply kept walking, as if he wasn't even sitting there. His jaw clenched, and he could feel the heat rising in his face. He tried to remain calm, but it was hard when it felt like everyone around him was being treated with respect and decency except for him and his daughter. Michael's hands tightened around the armrests as his baby stirred again. A soft whimper escaped her lips, and he immediately started to soothe her, his eyes never leaving Sarah's retreating figure. He glanced over at the other passengers seated in first class. They were being served with smiles and conversation. Their drinks arrived without delay. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed so different from what he was experiencing in that moment. Was it possible they all had some special privilege? Was there something about him that was different, or was he simply being ignored? His heart began to pound as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. He didn't want to make a scene, but he couldn't sit quietly any longer. The frustration bubbling inside him was now unmistakable. There was a weight in the air, an uncomfortable silence that seemed to follow him no matter where he looked. He stood up, gently shifting his daughter in his arms, trying to calm her down. As she started to whimper louder, now he caught the eye of one of the other flight attendants, a younger woman with dark hair, who had been walking down the aisle moments before. She glanced at him, then quickly looked away. But Michael wasn't going to let this go. He walked toward the front of the cabin, keeping his daughter close to his chest. His steps were purposeful, his resolve growing stronger with every stride. He reached the galley where Sarah was standing, preparing another round of drinks for passengers. She was talking to another attendant. When she saw him approaching, her smile faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "I've been waiting for service." Sarah looked at him for a moment as if deciding whether or not to acknowledge his presence. She finally nodded curtly. "I'll be right with you," she said without making any effort to move closer. Michael's eyes narrowed. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Now they were watching the silent exchange unfold in front of them. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had noticed the way he was being treated, but no one spoke up. No one seemed willing to say anything. He stood there for a moment, waiting for Sarah to return, but she didn't. She simply went about her work, as if nothing had happened, as if his presence didn't matter at all. Michael took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the frustration had already boiled over. He had to say something, or else he'd never get the respect he deserved. "Why are you ignoring me?" he asked, his voice low but clear. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah froze for a split second before turning her back to him again. This wasn't just poor service. It wasn't a simple mistake. It was something deeper. Michael could feel it, a quiet injustice taking place right in front of him, and it stung worse than anything else he'd ever experienced. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as Michael stood there watching Sarah walk away without a second glance. His heart was racing. The silence of the moment was deafening, and yet the hum of the engines seemed to grow louder in his ears. It was like the plane had become a suffocating box, and every passing minute made it harder for him to breathe. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing about it made sense. Why was he being treated like this? Why was he being ignored in a way that felt so deliberate, so cold? There was no way this could be a mistake. There had to be something else at play. But what Michael felt, the sting of embarrassment, burned deep in his chest. It wasn't just about poor service. It wasn't about the drink, or the food, or any of the little comforts the first-class passengers were enjoying. This was something bigger. It was about respect and dignity, and right now Michael wasn't getting any of that. He stood there, his daughter still fussing softly in his arms, trying to calm her. As he made his way back to his seat, he was acutely aware of the eyes of the other passengers on him. But no one spoke up, no one said anything. They simply watched. It was as if they were all just waiting to see what he would do next. The flight continued on, and with every passing minute the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. Michael's frustration was palpable now, but he was also feeling something else, a deep sense of injustice that kept gnawing at him. It wasn't just about what Sarah had done. It was about the message it sent not just to him, but to everyone around him. He tried to focus on his daughter, the soothing rhythm of his hand gently rocking her back and forth, but the sound of her soft whimpers only made his frustration worse. She was unsettled, she could feel the unease in the air, just like he could, and it made it harder for him to stay calm. He glanced around the cabin again. The flight attendants were still busy serving everyone else. They were laughing with passengers, engaging in friendly conversation, handing out drinks without a second thought. But when it came to him and his daughter, they couldn't even spare a moment of kindness. It was as if he didn't belong in this space, and the thought cut deep. He watched as Sarah passed by again. This time she didn't even glance in his direction. It was as if he had vanished entirely. She was carrying a tray of drinks for another couple this time. She stopped and asked them how their flight was going, how their day had been. She even complimented the woman's necklace and laughed along with the man as they joked about the weather. Michael's hands tightened around his daughter as he watched the scene unfold right in front of him. It wasn't just the lack of service, it was the blatant disregard for his presence, the way Sarah had made it so obvious that he didn't matter to her and now to the others in the cabin. He felt a pit form in his stomach. His mind raced as he struggled to process everything that was happening. The anger he felt was a sharp contrast to the sense of helplessness that seemed to paralyze him. There had to be a reason behind this behavior, but what was it? He had seen it before, he had experienced it before, but never in such a blatant way. He knew what it was, but he wasn't ready to confront it yet. Not in this moment. It was easier to pretend it was a mistake or an oversight. It was easier to convince himself that maybe he was reading too much into it. But then the moment came when he couldn't deny it anymore, when the reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks, and it was undeniable. Michael was being treated differently, and it wasn't because of anything he had done or said. It was because of who he was, and the realization left him shaken. The realization wasn't just about race or prejudice. It was about something much deeper. It was about the way people could be dismissed without a second thought, without even a moment of humanity to acknowledge their existence. It was about being made to feel invisible. He couldn't stand it anymore. The air around him felt suffocating, and he knew he had to say something. He couldn't let this go, not without standing up for himself and his daughter, not without confronting what was happening in front of him. As Sarah walked by yet again, Michael stood up this time. His voice was louder, his words deliberate, but calm. "Excuse me," he said, the words slipping out before he could second-guess himself. "I've asked for service multiple times now, and you keep ignoring me." Sarah stopped in her tracks this time. She couldn't avoid him. She turned slowly, her face hardening as she met his gaze. But she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to respond or walk away. The moment hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Sarah's eyes met Michael's, and for a split second there was a flicker of something in her gaze. It wasn't kindness or empathy. It was cold indifference, as if his presence didn't even warrant the slightest ounce of consideration. Her posture stiffened, but she didn't speak. She just stared at him, waiting for him to make his next move. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have. The other passengers were starting to notice. Some of them were watching intently. The tension was so thick it felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath. Michael stood there, his daughter still nestled in his arms, her small hand resting gently against his chest. His heart was pounding, but this time it wasn't just frustration that fueled him. It was the overwhelming need to confront what was happening, to speak up for himself and his daughter, and to demand that they be treated with the same respect everyone else on this plane had received. "Why are you doing this?" Michael asked, his voice steady, but cutting. The words came out before he could stop them. The question hung in the air between them. He wasn't asking out of anger anymore. It was a plea for an answer, a demand for explanation, and the question burned with a rawness that surprised even him. Sarah didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her arms crossed in front of her, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She didn't look flustered or guilty. She simply stared at him as if she was waiting for him to continue. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him now all around the cabin. The other passengers were watching the entire confrontation unfold. Some were staring openly, others trying to pretend they weren't paying attention. But Michael could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. The unease in the air was palpable, and as he stood there waiting for an answer from Sarah, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. It was about how people could be treated based on their race, how easily they could be dismissed, how easily someone like him could be ignored. He watched Sarah's face, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing whether to respond or simply brush him off. And for a moment it seemed like she was going to do just that, but then her lips parted, and she spoke. The words came out flat and devoid of any real emotion. "There's nothing to explain," she said, her tone dismissive. "I'll be with you when I have a chance." Michael felt a flash of anger rip through him, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to lose his cool, not now, not when he needed to be heard. "You've had your chance," he said, his voice hard now. "I've been sitting here ignored with my daughter for the past hour, while everyone else is being treated with respect, and you can't even give me the courtesy of a simple response." The words came out sharp like daggers cutting through the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. She just stood there, her expression unchanged, as if the conversation didn't matter to her at all, as if his words had no weight. That was when something inside Michael snapped. It wasn't just about the service anymore. It was about the blatant disregard for their dignity, their humanity. It was about the way she had made him feel small, invisible, and less than everyone else on that plane. He took a step closer now, his eyes locked onto hers. He wasn't backing down, not this time. "You're treating me like I don't belong here, like my presence doesn't matter." His voice was louder now, and there was no hiding the emotion that had been building inside him. It was raw and real, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. Sarah's eyes flickered briefly, but she didn't say anything. She simply turned on her heel and walked away, as if she had already decided that she wasn't going to give him any more of her time. Michael stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving with the weight of his anger and disbelief. He could feel his daughter's small body shifting in his arms. She was still restless and unsettled. He adjusted her in his arms, gently trying to calm her, but it was hard to focus on her when his mind was racing with everything that had just happened. He glanced around at the other passengers. Some of them were still watching him. Others had turned back to their own conversations, as if nothing had happened. It was as if they had all seen enough to make their judgment and had already decided that he was the problem, that he was overreacting. But Michael knew better. He knew what he had witnessed. He knew the way he had been treated wasn't a mistake. It wasn't poor service. It was deliberate. It was personal. And it hurt in a way he couldn't put into words. He sat back down slowly, still holding his daughter close to him. He looked out the window, his mind spinning with everything that had transpired. There was no going back now, no pretending that everything was fine. He had stood up for himself and his daughter, but it felt like the fight was far from over. Michael sat there, staring out the window, his thoughts racing as the hum of the plane's engines filled the quiet cabin. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Sarah had walked away without a word, her indifference like a slap in the face. He could feel the anger simmering inside him, but now it was mixed with something else, a heavy sense of dread that weighed on him. The silence in the cabin felt deafening now. It was as if the world around him had become distant and cold, like he had been cast adrift into a sea of apathy, and no one cared. He looked down at his daughter, still in his arms. She was sleeping now, her little face calm and peaceful, unaware of the storm that had just unfolded around them. Michael gently stroked her hair, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to calm himself. He knew he couldn't let this go, but the moment he had just experienced had left him shaken. It wasn't just the lack of service, it was the way he had been made to feel invisible. He glanced around the cabin again, this time with a different sense of awareness. He noticed the way people were looking at him. Some passengers were still trying to act normal, but others were clearly watching him closely, their eyes flicking over to him when they thought he wasn't looking. The tension in the air was thick, and Michael knew it wasn't just his imagination. The entire plane could feel it. He saw one of the flight attendants glance over at him from the back of the cabin. She seemed to hesitate before looking away quickly, but Michael was sure she had seen him standing up to Sarah. She had seen the confrontation, and now he was wondering if he was about to be punished for it. His mind raced with possibilities. What would happen next? Would they throw him off the plane? Would they somehow make his journey even worse than it already was? Was this what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated like you didn't belong? Would they call security, or just let him sit there and stew in his frustration? Michael's thoughts were a whirlwind as he tried to process everything. He felt the weight of the other passengers' eyes on him, their silent judgment, their unspoken opinions hanging in the air like an invisible cloud. Michael could feel himself shrinking under their gaze. It was like being trapped in a room where everyone was watching, but no one was willing to speak up. The stewardess who had first ignored him walked past him again. This time she didn't even glance at him, her eyes focused ahead, as if he wasn't even there. It was like he had become a ghost sitting in the seat next to the window. His frustration bubbled to the surface again, but this time there was no more patience in him. He had been pushed to his limit. He stood up abruptly, causing the woman to look up for a brief moment, but she quickly averted her gaze, her face betraying nothing as she continued down the aisle. Michael's blood boiled at the sight of her indifference, but he didn't care anymore. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just about bad service, it was something much worse. He walked toward the front of the plane, his footsteps heavy, his mind made up. This time, he wasn't going to wait for them to decide when it was his turn to be treated with respect. This time, he was going to take control of the situation. As he reached the galley, he saw Sarah talking to a colleague. She was laughing as she handed a drink to another passenger, but when she saw Michael approaching, her face immediately shifted into one of forced professionalism. "What can I do for you now?" she asked, her tone flat, almost dismissive, but Michael wasn't going to let her brush him off again. "You can start by explaining why I've been ignored this entire flight," he said, his voice loud enough for the other passengers to hear. "Why you've treated me like I don't matter, like my presence here isn't worth your time." Sarah's face hardened at his words, but she didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked over his shoulder, as if trying to find someone else to speak with. The cold indifference on her face was unbearable. Michael could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You've been treating me like a second-class citizen," he continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "My daughter, and I deserve the same respect as everyone else on this plane." For the first time, Sarah seemed caught off guard. Her eyes flickered, as if she hadn't expected this kind of confrontation from him. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't speak. She just stood there looking at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to respond or simply ignore him. Michael could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Now some were watching with mild curiosity, others were openly listening to the exchange. He could feel the weight of their attention like a spotlight shining on him, and for the first time in his life, he realized just how alone he truly felt. "I've asked you nicely," he said, his voice quiet now, but filled with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I just want to be treated with the same dignity as everyone else." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah's face seemed to soften just a fraction. The tightness in her jaw loosened, and her gaze seemed to waver, but it was only for a brief second before she quickly regained her composure. "I'll have someone assist you shortly," she said, her voice now clipped and cold, but Michael didn't care. He had said what he needed to say, and for a moment he felt the weight of the silence in the cabin shift just slightly. The seconds dragged on as Sarah turned away without a word, the coldness in her expression still lingering like a heavy fog around them. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to sit back down. Not yet, not after everything that had happened. His eyes scanned the cabin again, but this time he wasn't looking for anyone to meet his gaze. He was looking for any sign of support, any sign that someone else might be willing to speak up. But the more he looked, the more he realized he was alone in this. The passengers around him were silent, their eyes either downcast or pretending not to notice the tension in the air. It was as if everyone had decided to turn a blind eye to what was happening, as if they were all complicit in the silence that had settled over the plane. Michael felt the sting of their indifference deep in his gut. It was worse than Sarah's treatment. It was the fact that no one cared enough to even acknowledge what was happening. He returned to his seat, his daughter still nestled in his arms, her soft breaths the only comfort he had left in that moment. He gently rocked her back and forth, trying to soothe her, but it was hard to focus on anything other than the anger that burned in his chest. He couldn't let it go, not this time, not when he had been made to feel so small. The plane continued on its flight, but the journey now felt like an eternity. Every minute stretched into another long and painful second. Michael's thoughts were a whirlwind, and no matter how hard he tried to focus on his daughter or distract himself from the situation, his mind kept returning to the same questions. Why had this happened? Why had he been treated like this? Why was he the one being singled out? He glanced at the clock above the cabin and realized the flight was already over halfway done. He didn't know how much longer he could sit there pretending that everything was fine, pretending that he wasn't being treated like an outsider. But as he looked around the cabin, he saw the familiar faces of the other passengers. They were all going about their business, as if nothing had happened. They were sipping their drinks, reading their books, chatting with each other, and Michael realized that they had all chosen not to get involved. He couldn't help but wonder how many of them had noticed the way he was being treated, how many of them had seen Sarah's deliberate disregard for him, but hadn't said anything. Maybe it wasn't just about race or prejudice. Maybe it was about the quiet complicity of silence, the way people turned away from uncomfortable truths, as if pretending it wasn't happening would somehow make it go away. His fists clenched tightly around the armrests. His teeth gritted in frustration, the pressure building in his chest, threatening to burst open. The injustice of it all seemed to press in on him from all sides. He had tried to reason with Sarah. He had tried to stay calm, but it hadn't worked. And now he could feel the anger and humiliation threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced up just in time to see Sarah passing by again. This time she was walking quickly, as if trying to avoid looking at him. But Michael wasn't going to let her off so easily this time. He stood up and moved into the aisle, his eyes locked on hers. And as she saw him approaching, she faltered for just a moment before continuing on her path. But Michael wasn't about to let her walk away. "You've ignored me long enough," he said, his voice loud and firm, the words cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. Sarah stopped mid-step, her back stiffened, and she turned to face him. But this time Michael wasn't going to let her deflect. He wasn't going to back down anymore. "You're treating me like I don't matter," he continued, his voice unwavering, "and I won't stand for it anymore. I've asked for service, I've asked for respect, and all you've done is avoid me. Why is that?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Sarah stood there, her face tightening with something that Michael couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Was it frustration? Or was it just the coldness of someone who didn't care? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The entire plane seemed to be waiting for her response. But Sarah didn't say anything. Instead, she just looked at him, as if weighing her options, weighing whether it was worth her time to respond. The tension in the air was so thick that it almost felt suffocating, and Michael could feel his anger start to rise again. But this time he didn't let it control him. This time he held on to his calm, even though every part of him wanted to shout, wanted to demand an apology from her and from everyone else who had turned a blind eye to what was happening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah spoke, but her words were as cold as ice. "I've already told you that I'll send someone to assist you soon," she said, her voice clipped but still betraying a hint of frustration. Michael didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her, his mind racing with everything he had just said and done. But inside, he knew something had changed. He had stood up for himself and for his daughter. He had taken control of the situation in a way that made it clear he wasn't going to be ignored any longer. He turned away from her and sat back down in his seat, the anger still simmering inside him. But now there was a small sense of victory, a small but powerful realization that he wasn't powerless in this moment. The minutes passed by slowly, but to Michael it felt like hours as the plane continued its course through the sky. The pressure in the cabin was almost unbearable. Now the tension was thick. It hung over him like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The soft murmurs of conversation from the other passengers had quieted down, the quiet hum of the engines only adding to the discomfort. He could still feel the weight of their eyes on him, as if they were all waiting to see what would happen next. But Michael didn't care anymore. He had already made his stand. His hands were trembling slightly, but it wasn't from fear, it was from the raw emotion still coursing through him. His anger hadn't faded, it had only grown sharper, more focused now. It wasn't just about the flight attendant's actions. It was about the way he had been made to feel less than human, the way she had treated him, as if he was nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be ignored and dismissed. He glanced down at his daughter, still resting peacefully in his arms. The little life he held in his hands was the only thing that could still calm him in the midst of the storm that raged inside his chest. He kissed her forehead softly, whispering words of reassurance that he didn't fully believe himself. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to see her father treated like this. But Michael knew that he couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for what was right. He looked up as the flight attendants began to make their rounds again. This time, a different one approached him. She was older, more seasoned than Sarah, but Michael could see the hesitation in her eyes. As she drew closer, it was clear she had heard what had happened, and now she was trying to assess how to deal with the situation. "Sir," she said in a polite but somewhat cautious tone, "how may I assist you?" Her voice wasn't as dismissive as Sarah's, but there was still something about the way she spoke that didn't feel genuine. It felt like she was just going through the motions, as if she was only offering help because it was part of her job, and not because she truly cared. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and steadied himself. The anger still bubbled beneath the surface. But now there was also a new feeling that had started to take root. It was the feeling of being seen. It was the recognition that he had fought for his dignity and had made it clear that he wouldn't be dismissed any longer. "You can start by telling me why I've been ignored this whole time," Michael said, his voice firm but controlled, the words coming out more calmly than he felt inside. "I've been asking for help for over an hour, and no one's cared enough to respond." The older flight attendant's eyes flickered slightly, but she didn't immediately speak. Instead, she looked over at Sarah, who was standing just a few rows away, her eyes avoiding Michael's gaze. But Michael didn't look away this time. He held her gaze with a quiet defiance, as if daring her to ignore him again. "Sir, I apologize for the delay," the older flight attendant said finally. "We've been short-staffed today, and I'll make sure to send someone over to take care of your needs right away." But Michael wasn't satisfied with that answer. He had heard the same excuse from Sarah. He had heard it from so many people in his life who tried to justify their actions with empty words and half-hearted apologies. "Short-staffed," Michael repeated, his voice rising slightly. "That's the excuse you're going with." He could feel his pulse quickening, but he didn't care anymore. He had had enough of the half-truths and the dismissals. "I'm sitting here with my daughter, and we've been treated like we don't belong here, and you think short-staffed is an explanation that makes sense?" He continued, his voice steady, but now laced with an undeniable anger. The older flight attendant looked uncomfortable, but she didn't back down. She gave him a polite smile, but Michael saw the tightness in her jaw, the tension in her shoulders. She didn't want to be here in this moment, but he wasn't going to back down either. "I understand your frustration," she said slowly, "and I'll make sure someone helps you soon, but I need you to understand that we are doing our best under difficult circumstances." Michael could feel the rage rising again. It was hard to keep his emotions in check, but he wasn't going to let her deflect anymore. He wasn't going to let her use the same excuses that people always used when they didn't want to take responsibility. "Don't tell me you're doing your best," he snapped, his voice sharp and unrelenting. "You've been ignoring me this whole time, and now that I stood up for myself, suddenly you want to pretend like everything is fine." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The older flight attendant seemed to take a step back, and Sarah continued to avoid looking at him, her expression unreadable. But Michael could feel the weight of everything shifting. This wasn't just about service anymore. It was about something far deeper than that. It was about the way he had been made to feel less than human simply because of who he was. His daughter shifted in his arms, and he took a deep breath. His gaze softened as he looked down at her. Once again, the frustration still burned inside him, but in that moment he realized something profound. It wasn't just about what had happened on this flight. It was about the long journey he had been on to reclaim his own sense of worth, to remind himself that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He was worthy of respect just as much as anyone else, and that realization was the most powerful thing he could hold on to in this moment. The moment hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating everything around him. Michael sat there holding his daughter, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The silence that had fallen between him and the flight attendants felt as though it was the calm before another storm. But deep down, Michael knew this was the end of the line. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't just sit back down and pretend like nothing had happened, not when he had already made his stand, not when his dignity had been trampled over so many times. He looked up and saw Sarah still standing in the back of the cabin. Her eyes were glued to the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though she was trying to disappear into the walls of the plane. Michael could feel the cold indifference in the air. He could feel her refusal to even acknowledge the weight of his words, the depth of the humiliation she had caused. But he knew he wasn't going to let her escape this moment. He wasn't going to let her ignore him any longer. His grip on his daughter tightened. As he stood up again this time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. He moved toward the front of the plane, his steps resolute, his eyes locked on Sarah, who still refused to meet his gaze. As he approached her, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the nervousness creeping into her posture. She knew what was coming. "Sarah," Michael's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the authority in it, the way it cut through the air. "Look at me." There was a pause, and for a moment he thought she might turn away again, but then her eyes slowly lifted, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like hours. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else in her eyes, something that flickered for just a second before she masked it with a cold indifference. "You've treated me with disrespect," Michael said slowly, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. "And I can't just let that go." Sarah's lips parted, but she didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. She was caught in the truth of his words, but her pride wouldn't allow her to admit any wrongdoing. Instead, she just stood there silent, but Michael could see it now. He could see that her silence was her guilt, her refusal to apologize, was her admission of her own failure. "I don't care if you're short-staffed," Michael continued, his voice rising now. "I don't care about any excuse you try to give me. The truth is you treated me like I didn't matter. You treated me like I wasn't even human, and I won't accept that." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment there was only silence. The other passengers were watching now, their eyes flicking back and forth between him and Sarah. It was impossible to ignore the shift in the atmosphere. The tension had become almost unbearable. Everyone could feel it. Everyone knew that this was the breaking point. But as Michael stood there facing Sarah, he didn't feel fear or anger anymore. He didn't feel rage. He just felt a sense of quiet resolve. He had made his point. He had said everything that needed to be said, and now it was up to her to decide what came next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah spoke, but her words were different this time. There was no defensiveness, no coldness in her voice, just a quiet admission of what she knew to be true. "You're right," she said, her voice soft and weary. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I don't have an excuse for it." Michael stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. He wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't looking for her to validate him. But hearing her finally acknowledge the truth was something that he needed to hear more than anything. He nodded slowly, his heart still racing, but now there was a sense of relief that started to wash over him. He had done what he came here to do. He had stood up for his dignity, and for his daughter he had refused to let himself be erased. "Thank you," Michael said quietly, his voice almost a whisper as he turned and made his way back to his seat. As he sat back down, the weight of the moment slowly started to lift, but something had shifted inside of him. Something fundamental. He realized that he didn't need the approval of others to feel valued. He didn't need anyone to give him permission to stand up for himself. He had proven that to himself today. The flight continued on, but it felt different now. The tension in the cabin had broken. The silence was no longer oppressive, and as Michael looked down at his daughter, resting peacefully in his arms, he knew that this moment would stay with him for a long time. It wasn't just about what had happened on this flight. It was about reclaiming his own sense of worth, about refusing to let anyone make him feel invisible again. He closed his eyes for a moment, the hum of the engines in the background, a steady reminder that life went on, but he was no longer the same person who had boarded this flight. He had taken back his dignity, he had made his stand, and now he could breathe again.